Salams from the People's Dispatch studios here in New Delhi. I'm Siddhantani and you're watching Daily Debrief. On the show today, we're talking about Hiroshima Day, a meeting between the presidents of Russia and Turkey, and the start of the new season of the English Premier League. Our top story: every year on the 6th of August, Hiroshima Day is marked. It's the day the United States dropped an atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima, destroying almost all of the city and killing anywhere between 100 and 150,000 people, most of whom were civilians. 3 days later, they dropped another nuclear bomb on Nagasaki with equally horrific results. It was the first and only time atomic or nuclear weapons have been used in war, and 77 years later, we can't help but wonder if the world has forgotten what the prospects of the use of these weapons means for humanity. In Europe, East Asia, South Asia, and now, with negotiations on the Iran nuclear deal having come to a de facto stalemate, West Asia as well, the world is littered with potential nuclear flashpoints. Prashant is in studio to talk about why Hiroshima Day is important and why we must remember the politics of peace. Prashant, first of all, 77 years later, can you tell us a little bit about how this day is marked and remembered by the world at large?
Right, Siddhant, this year is actually a very interesting year because the 10th review process of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is going on. It is supposed to happen in 2020. It's happening in 2022. So there's an additional amount of discussions and talk about the threat of nuclear weapons, for instance. In fact, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, just a few days ago, we talked about it on the show as well, talked about how we were one miscalculation or one misunderstanding away from total nuclear annihilation. Now, these are not, let's be very fair, these are not an exaggerated account or just alarmist in any sense, because that is really how dangerous things are. So today we have about 13,000 nuclear warheads in the world, the bulk of it owned by the United States and Russia, because all other countries are less than 500 in each. So these two countries really own the bulk of it. And over the past decades, we've seen multiple instances of what are called, of what are very near flashpoints, in the sense that say orders were given, somebody raised an objection, it didn't happen, there were misunderstandings of another country having initiated the strike. Geese, I believe, were believed to have been a nuclear strike. So we've come very close, actually. The Cuban Missile Crisis, for instance, we've come far more closer to nuclear war than many of us really understand or imagine. And so in some senses, there is a sense over the years of having gotten used to nuclear weapons, which really is a mistake, because unfortunately the fact is that we are still very close, perilously close to any kind of nuclear disaster. And large reason for that is that we'll come to it a bit more later, but it's the fact that it is the nuclear states of the world which are predominantly on the verge of a conflict at many points of time. Yeah. And a huge role is played by the US in it. But more importantly, what has also happened is that there's been a disintegration of some of the treaties which were devised in the 70s and 80s and 90s to sort of prevent this kind of disaster. So we know, for instance, that the anti-ballistic missile treaty, which played a very important role, the US walked out of it. The New START has been extended, but it still kind of really depends on who's in power right now, and that's a big issue. The fact that with any US election can produce a leader who's going to walk out of all these treaties and render the situation far more even tense. And we have also seen a competitive race in missile building, which means that countries are investing more in building more hypersonic missiles, for instance, missiles which can bypass shields. All this leading to a very delicate situation, not to mention the fact that many of these nuclear weapons are deployed at very crucial, at flashpoints. Yeah. So all this together, I think we've reached a strange situation where I think it doesn't really occur to, it's not in the conversation of many of us. We talk about it maybe a bit casually, but if you look at the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, there was a very consistent anti-nuclear war movement that existed, because there were people that the memories of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were very fresh. Now we have kind of reached a place where I think many people sort of take it for granted that these exist, but we really underestimate what is the nature of this deployment and how close we are.
Prashant, we mentioned some of the flashpoints and how used to we have become of sort of living with this threat. Can you, I know we have a very short amount of time on the show, but the best you can sort of explain a little bit of the politics around some of these important or major flashpoints.
Right, so one problem I often find with this discussion around flashpoints is they do not look at the larger geopolitical context. For instance, people say Korea is a nuclear flashpoint. They say West Asia is a nuclear flashpoint. Ukraine is a nuclear flashpoint. But the fact is that it is not North Korea or South Korea which is predominantly the reason for it, or it's not, in West Asia, it's not Iran which is the reason for it. It's actually the result of many of these countries responding to what is the larger growth of the US strategic machine across the globe. So for instance, I think one point that we often made before on this show as well is the fact that these countries have seen what happened to Yugoslavia, they've seen what happened to country like Libya. And people like, for instance, the North Korean leader, they have concluded that the only way to sort of, or Iraq for that matter, the people like the leaders in North Korea, even people in the leadership sections in Iran, they've increasingly come to the conclusion that the only way to keep off the United States and its ways of encircling you and crushing you is to maybe come up with a nuclear deterrent. And that's unfortunate, but that is the case. So what unites Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein and all these people is that they did not have a nuclear deterrent, whereas the leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, is still very much in power, right? So keeping that in mind, that's a very important aspect. So you cannot actually look at these so-called flashpoints without looking at the role of the United States in it. A lot of talk about Iran, for instance, enriching uranium, which could potentially lead to a weapon. Now, two things. Iran has once said that it does not want to develop a weapon, and more importantly, we have reached this moment because the US walked out of the nuclear deal. Let's take Korea, for instance. The United States, there is still a state of war because a formal peace has not been declared after the Korean War that took place in the 50s. And where did that come from again? That was again the result of US encirclement of the region. And you look at, say, a country like Israel, which is the only unofficial nuclear one of the unofficial nuclear countries, so to speak. Where does it get its support from? So all these places, for that matter, even Ukraine. It is true that Russia did invade Ukraine, but what was the larger context? So I think that, it is also very important that we do not see non-proliferation, or we do not see the issue of nuclear weapons as isolated from the issue of global justice. As long as, for instance, countries, as long as there is no hope of an equitable world order, it is very likely that countries will continue to believe that somehow keeping a nuclear deterrent is their best way to not get overwhelmed or attacked or invaded. So unless there are guarantees of justice, unless there are guarantees of peace, there is going to be, it is very difficult to also envision the end of nuclear weapons. So it's not just about dismantling nuclear weapons and all that. It's also about the question of the global order, right? And what it means. What it means in today's world. And we do know, of course, that and this goes back to the very beginning. We do know that the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs were not essential to defeat Japan. They were done also as part of salvo against the USSR. It was the first salvo against the USSR, as they say. So keeping all this in mind, a very important conversation that we should keep having. We should never stop talking about it. We should never stop raising this at all possible quarters, because a nuclear disaster, the nuclear war, for instance, once it starts, it'll just end in complete disaster.
All right. Thanks, Prashant, for that. Quite grim picture, actually, of where we are in the world, but it's not something that we can really hide away from at all. We're moving on now to a meeting between Russian President Vladimir Putin, who welcomed his Turkish counterpart Recep Tayyip Erdogan to the Black Sea resort of Sochi on Friday, at talks aimed at increasing economic cooperation and, no doubt, of course, the Ukraine war as well. Putin thanked Erdogan, who is facing elections at home very soon, for his role in the resumption of grain shipments out of Ukraine, and of course those of Russian grain and fertilizers as well. Exports had come to a halt as hostilities escalated on both sides. On Friday, 3 ships carrying a total of around 60,000 tons of grain left Odessa for Britain, Turkey and Ireland. Prashant is still with us, of course, in studio for more on this story. Prashant, these are closed-door talks, bilateral talks between these two countries, but there's a lot of speculation around them, what they might be talking about, and of course, sections of the Western media have headlined it as a meeting of the big bad guys in this secret lair. What is your reading of events?
Right, so this takes place at a very crucial time for both the countries, because Erdogan has emerged as some kind of a mediator between the various parties as far as the Ukraine war is concerned. Now, we know that Erdogan has a very problematic record internally, and we'll of course come to that as well. But the fact remains that he's sort of very skillfully, we have to acknowledge that he's very skillfully played the role of a mediator. On the one hand, he's kept engagement with NATO up, but he sort of gained what he wanted to gain, at least symbolically, on the matter of Finland and Sweden joining NATO. He used that as an attempt to further attack the PKK and its supporters in these countries. And he's also sort of engaging with the United States and the NATO allies on one hand. On the other hand, like you said, Turkey and Russia do have some strategic differences, but that has not stopped these countries from continuing to engage. Recently, they're engaged in Tehran as well on the matter of the Astana talks. Syria, for instance, will come to that. So all this together, Erdogan has played a very careful game, sort of emerging as the one channel amid warmongering all the warmongering that is taking place. So at this point of time, it is important for Putin also to sort of engage with him. There are differences, of course, but there are a lot of issues where there's a common ground between them, and we must remember this is not only about the Ukraine war. This is also about Central Asia, where which is where a lot of complicated processes are going on. We know about Armenia and Azerbaijan. We know about Kazakhstan. So in all these places, there have been both Turkey and Russia have their hold and say, so to speak. So this is really one of those diplomatic processes where two countries which have converging as well as convergent as well as divergent interests are sort of carefully trying to figure out where they want to position themselves and how best they can work together and how best they can sort of not entirely resolve but manage the differences they have between each other. And both countries are important for each other. Like I said, that Erdogan provides Putin as well a channel to sort of for some of these negotiations. And for Erdogan, Russia is important because it provides a good counterweight as it seeks to engage, as it engages with NATO in a much more different way. We know that Turkey now has been far more harsher towards and NATO and the European Union. On the other hand, Turkey also plays a very important role of acting as a defense defense in quotes for the European Union against refugees. I mean, they are the country which holds most of these refugees, and again uses that as a bargaining point with all these countries. So Turkey located right now at a very, very, very symbolic, a very powerful position in multiple issues. We have refugees, we have war, we have Central Asia, we have say climate for that matter, we have energy supplies. And energy supplies were also discussed there. So in all these places, Turkey is in a very important place. And right now, it's trying to leverage as much as this is possible. For Erdogan, this is doubly important because he's facing a huge domestic crisis. Elections are coming next year. The Turkish economy is in a very bad state. So he's also been sort of trying to use that as much as possible. He met with the Saudis recently as a good example. So a lot of diplomacy going on right now. And I think some of the more concrete results we'll see only as time passes.
Right. So with all of that context, Prashant, how are some of these differences going to be sort of worked out? And given the complicated or problematic domestic reputation that Erdogan has, how is that going to play out as we lead up to a fresh set of elections also in Turkey?
Right. So Erdogan, I think, currently facing two key sets of pressures. One is massively on the economic front, and this is something which is why he's engaging the Russians, he's engaging the Saudis, he's engaging everybody he can, the Emiratis, for instance, on this matter to try to somehow bring back some amount of economic stability before the elections next year. The other main issue he's facing, of course, is the issue of refugees, which sections of the other right in Turkey, there are many sections of right in the Turkey, including Erdogan, are you using as a major point to sort of batter him. And this has become a very key element in Turkish internal politics, the question of, as far as some of these right-wing sections are concerned, pushing back the Syrian refugees. And so Erdogan himself has tried to take the initiative by declaring an invasion of Syria, where he plans to resettle some of these refugees. For that, he needs some amount of Russian support as well, because Russia and Turkey have been engaging on this issue for very long. So any military effort or any massive population shifting that Erdogan tries to do needs the support of Russians and at least at least their silent consent, if not their support.
Right.
So this is a very key aspect for Erdogan as well, and it plays a huge role in his internal politics because he fears being outflanked on the issue of refugees by sections of the right which have a far more xenophobic message. Now Erdogan too, has adopted elements of this message, but he is nonetheless being beaten as far as this kind of xenophobia goes by other sections who are very clear in terms of push the refugees out, and they're really not our problem, and blaming refugees for all kinds of issues. And this is substantially and this has substantially affected the internal political discourse in Turkey as well. So keeping all these things in mind, a very difficult game for Erdogan to play, especially right now in Syria. There is an operation that is going on inside Iraq, for instance, Iraqi Kurdistan. Turkish forces have bombed and attacked these places, killed people. So all this together, he is fighting a battle on multiple fronts, and remains to be seen if he can actually hold on till 2023.
All right, thanks Prashant. Good to have you back in studio after a few days. And finally, the English Premier League, which is arguably the most popular football league in the world, began a new season early this morning, at least in my time zone, with Arsenal beating Crystal Palace by 2-0 to go top of the table for what might well be a very short-lived stint as far as Arsenal's track record is concerned. But as with every season, the weeks before have been heavy with transfer rumors and other news and several controversies, some real, some generated. The media wheel around that Premier League circus keeps churning whether season is on or not. And to summarize some of the early chatter, I spoke earlier via video conference to football writer Vaibhav Raghunandan. Vaibhav, good to have you back on Daily Debrief. For a lot of people around the world, a lot of football fans, this is the most exciting time of the year, the start of another season. And because the Premier League is as popular as it is, I guess globally, this is the beginning of one league that around the world people look forward to. In that context, what are you sitting in your little corner of Eastern India most excited about for the 2023-24 season? Is it 22-23 season? Sorry.
22, 22, 23. So, I mean, first of all, the Premier League never really goes away. It's just always, it's through the year. We're always in the Premier League. This is the Premier League world. The second thing is that, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of simply because there's a lot of this transfers, this, what I like to think of as a modern day human trading. That's pretty much it, like, which everyone is so engrossed in. This, the money behind human beings being traded to different places by different entities. But yeah, I mean, looking forward to, honestly, it's what I'm looking forward to this season is that in light of the English women winning the Euros, a lot of the focus will now also shift onto like how the WSL, the Women's Super League, is branded alongside in comparison to the Premier League itself. And there's a lot to think about there, simply because first of all, like, for example, just a club like Arsenal, for example, Arsenal, the women's season tickets have been sold out completely in light of their Euros triumph. And yesterday, the men's team were playing against Crystal Palace. That was actually the season opener. And there was a lot of talk about how this is the first time that the women have actually sold out their season tickets before the men have. So that is like one thing to really think about. But in the context of purely the Premier League, there is the usual simple narratives, which is who's going to win the league. And it always boils down to three clubs. And those three clubs are Manchester United, Liverpool, and Chelsea. And they have, I mean, despite the fact that apparently Chelsea's manager has been cribbing about how they've not made enough signings and they've only signed 3 outstanding players this season in the transfer window. So he's going to have a tough time. It'll also come down to like how United does. It's been, a decade now of them not doing anything at all. And whether you like it or not, whether you support Manchester United or not, they're the biggest team in the Premier League. From our context, sitting in my corner of Eastern India, sitting in my corner of Asia, they're the biggest team in the world. So a lot of fans here, a lot of support groups. So it'll be like a big thing for how Manchester United does, simply because they've had a really weird off-season where they've had a new manager, and the new manager has come with a great Ajax philosophy and this and that, and there's been a lot of talk about that. But then a couple of signings have gone awry. They tried to sign a player from Barcelona, and that fell through. And then, of course, the prodigal son is creating a lot of problems for United by not adhering to the way that perhaps they thought it would work out.
But a little bit, very quickly, if we can talk about what's happening off the pitch. 2 major things that sort of came to light. There have been, as there always are with men's sport, unfortunately, setups, allegations of sexual assault and rape, even against certain players. The identities have so far been kept secret by the police investigating these allegations. But the Premier League has decided to, for the first time, introduce mandatory consent training for everyone. First of all, what does this mean? And and why is it so important?
Well, it's important simply because, I mean, one of the players, by the way, was accused of violence against women as well as rape, was dropped by his club last season. We know his name. It's Mason Greenwood. We're living in a time right now where all of this needs to be taken way more seriously. it's again like before the show began, you and me are talking, and you said that it's 2022, and I can't believe we're teaching men consent training, but it's 2022, and it's about time we also did teach men consent training. Like, it's really important to teach them. But also, like, I want to just point out that this is how I don't have a nice word for it, but this is how bad it is that we are as a society, that when these allegations surfaced of a player who plays, this is all we know, there's a player who plays for a London-based club and was accused of rape of 3 different women, one of whom has dropped charges. So at that point of time, the debate should have centered around this, right? Like, about like how this is happening in the Premier League, one of the most watched leagues, and like how a player is doing this. But instead, in online spaces, the conversation became about like which club this player is from, and fans from 2 different clubs basically just started finding like instances of when perhaps that player had been called into the investigation and therefore had been dropped by his club, and therefore had not been able to appear for games. And it just turned into this like I wish it was like a bad Agatha Christie novel where these fans were basically attacking each other and saying like it was your club, failing to understand the larger picture of this whole thing, which is that men are not like, I mean, they're just not responsible enough. They just don't care about women's lives enough.
Sure, and the all pervading sort of culture of toxic masculinity that
absolutely like that is exactly it. Like that is
in which yeah, fair enough. I'm continuing from there, Vaibhav, to bring up the last point. Last year, last season at least, players began games by taking a knee to protest racial injustice and demand equality and fairness in the world. This year, it seems the decision has been taken by club captains in consultation with their players that indicates they are taking the approach of less is more, meaning that they will not be taking a knee in all games, but they will be doing it in certain games in order to, I don't know, increase the marginal utility of each time they take a knee.
Oh man, like there's so much to like say about this, like, first of all, yes, I mean, I will also say that this whole taking the knee started during the start of the pandemic, when the Black Lives Matter protests had begun. At that point of time, in empty stadiums, these players were taking a knee. Then when they came back to full stadiums, there were several clubs, there were several sets of supporters who booed their teams for taking the knee. But also, I remember speaking during the Euros last year to someone who works in the Ministry of Sport in Austria. And she'd said to me that it had devolved into an advertising campaign. It had just become like, we will do this and this is enough. Just taking the knee is enough. So when they say less is more, I sincerely hope what they mean is that we will take the knee less, but we will do more to make sure that there is equality on all fronts. And if they do that, then I think less is more is a great approach. But if less is more means that, you know what, we're going to stop taking the knee also, we're going to do it like only 50% of the time, and we're going to do nothing else, then we're back to square one, and there seems to be no point. This is absolutely pointless. I mean, what we're doing here. I do think this whole thing has devolved into a bit of a farce, and I don't know. I mean, there seems to be no balanced solution for this, but at least people were talking about it. But yeah, I mean, were they?
Fair enough. And I think Mr. Bhandari, who heads the program for the Premier League called Kick It Out, which is their anti-racism sort of program, also put it very well by saying, that it's fine, whatever players decide to do, however they decide to voice their opinions, their protest is fine, as long as we talk about why they are taking a knee in the first place, and not about the act of taking the knee as the focal point and all of it. So thanks for all that, Weber. We're out of time. In fact, we've probably gone a little bit over. But thanks again for being on Daily Debrief, and we'll see you soon.
Right, that's all we have on this episode of Daily Debrief from Vaibhav, myself, and the entire team here at People's Dispatch. Thank you very much for watching. We'll be off till Monday. We'll see you again then. But for more details on all of these stories, as always, please head over to our website, peoplesdispatch.org, and give us a follow on the social media platform of your choice. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.